Okay. Hello. So I'm Simon Laird. I'm here today with David Dennison. David, are you in Thailand, did you say?
I am, yeah. I live in northern Thailand.
How long have you lived there?
8 years.
All right. How is it?
It's wonderful. I'm trying not to jump ahead too far, but it's been a very interesting experience as somebody who likes to think and write about politics because Thailand is very different from the West. But the quality of life, the standard of living is very high here. If you're making anything approximating a Western income, which I am, my wife and I are teachers. Um, and it's a very easy country to transplant into because it's such a welcoming culture and it's such a relaxed culture, that the experience of living here and of raising kids here has been terrific. So I have two children. They're still asleep. One is a teenager, but
It sounds great. Maybe if America collapses, I'll have to escape to the north of Thailand.
it should be high on your list when the tariff apocalypse means that you're using leaves for toilet paper again. We
Right.
still have toilet paper, and we had toilet paper during COVID, which was nice. So
Well, I think I found so you have a podcast called Dave's Dispatches on Spotify. People can check that out. And
I do. Let me just interject there. The podcast is going to be undergoing kind of a transformation. I really don't like the format I was using for it. So if you're hearing this and you want to hear more of me, give it like a couple months, and the podcast
Okay.
should be
People can check in
under
a
a
couple
different.
months.
Yeah,
And
it's not a very good podcast, but yes, I have one.
And I think I found you through Substack, your Substack article about the trans athletes issue. I think that one went viral.
Yeah. Yeah, that one did. That one generated a lot of attention, which surprised me because I thought it was predicated on what is ultimately a very bad idea, which I offered in it. But I had had this frustration for some years actually, because a couple people criticized me. They were like, "Dave, you really should have slept on that one for a few days." It's like, well, I slept on it for like 5 years. I don't know what that says about me. Um, but so much of the activist pressure, particularly on the sports issue, is, I think, built on what is just an obvious and complete lie, which is that there are no predictable or observable performance differences in the way that men and women play sports. And if you really think that's true, though, if you're really committed to the idea that, well, a guy who plays football is as likely to be as good as a woman who plays football, well, then what would that mean? It would mean that you should just desegregate sports. And it would mean that any disparity in males and females participating in that sport could be chalked up to discrimination. Well, so if you're on the left, what do you do about discrimination? You do what the left already does about discrimination, and you have some form of quotas, or you have some form of non-meritocratic acceptance into the sport. And so what I ultimately argued was, and this really wasn't me arguing it, this was me being intentionally obtuse about it. But if you are actually committed to that belief, then, well, here's how we could do it. You would desegregate everything and you would establish quotas, and you would say the men and the women on the professional baseball team have to get equal playing time within a certain margin of error. And if they don't, they're in trouble with the league. And in sports that are contact sports, where that would be, you would still be facing some serious safety issues. You could say, okay, well, we're going to re-stratify, and we'll do it by something like weight class or something like physical characteristics that mean that, the really good quarterback who's a 5'6" woman is not getting sacked by a 350-pound defensive lineman. Um, do I think we should do that? No. But what really gets my goat is when people make arguments that I think are knowingly disingenuous in service
Right.
of a broader goal. And so I was making my own disingenuous argument in service of a broader goal. So
I'm not sure you actually necessarily have to assert that there are no performance differences because it seems like if there were a woman, a biological woman who just happened to be 6'4" and be the best athlete ever, it seems like there would be nothing unfair about her playing against other women in the women's leagues. She would just happen to be more
she would just
athletic
happen to be
than the
good.
rest of them. Yeah.
Well, and you get a variant of that, don't you, already? So one of the things that trans activists are fond of countering with when you say, well, if you were to actually do this, women would be functionally wiped out because men are so much better. And what people point to is somebody like Michael Phelps, who enjoys these enormous physical advantages over his competitors. And they
Right.
say, well, we allow that. Why then is it such a problem when Leah Thomas has a strong competitive advantage? And there may not actually be a good answer to that, except that this is how we have typically done it since we started having organized women's sports, that we have segregated it by biological sex. And the other point I was making in my piece is that discrimination and civil rights and even inclusion are, I think, the wrong lenses through which to view this issue, because nobody's excluding trans athletes. They're holding them to the same standard that cis athletes are held to, which is that no, you've just got to compete in this league. And it's hard to call that discrimination, and I think,
Yeah,
and I think
absolutely.
that might be temperatures if we recognize that people aren't actually being denied the right to play a sport.
I think that the crux of the issue is really whether you believe that trans women are women or not. Because if there were
Right,
an actual
yeah.
woman, if there were an actual woman who was being singled out and forced to enter into the men's league, that would be very nasty. That would be absurd. And I think that I think that the trans people want to play sports in the opposite sex league. It never seems like their love of the sport is the real motivation. It seems more like they want to be affirmed. And so they want to enter this single sex space for the purpose of affirming their own self-identity as the opposite sex.
That is almost certainly true of some of them. And it is, I think maybe the more relevant issue there is that it is definitely true of some of the activists pushing for this. That
Hmm.
it is not, my concern is to have more robust competition in women's swimming. No, this is a political issue, and this is um, people who don't particularly care about sports, which by the way, I mostly don't.
I don't care about
Uh,
sports at all.
yeah, are attaching themselves to this for reasons other than trying to preserve the integrity of athletic competition. And that's okay. We can do that. You didn't have to follow baseball to think that the Negro Leagues were a mistake and that we should not have been segregating baseball players by race. So it's completely okay to do that. But you maybe ought to state those priors up front. And if you are sounding off on either side of this, because it really does frustrate me on both sides, that if you're sounding off about the politics of the issue and it's evident that you don't have any concern whatsoever for the impact that's going to have on the sport, state that. Just be honest about that and don't pretend that you care about something you don't obviously don't care about.
Yeah, and I think unlike other people on the right, I will just say I don't care about women's sports. I care about the issue because I think that society should not affirm transgender ideology.
Right. And I don't want to grab the third rail with both hands here. I think we're talking about two different categories when we talk about trans people. Probably we're talking about more than two categories, but really it's at least two baskets that are hugely important in my view. I think when this conversation really kicked into high gear, which maybe you could date to 5 or 6 years ago, maybe you
I
go
would
back
I would
10.
have said 10. I distinctly remember being, I think, a senior in high school in 2014 when the cover of Time magazine came out and it was I think a transgender athlete and the headline was the transgender tipping.
Caitlyn Jenner, maybe?
What's that?
Was it Caitlyn Jenner? That
No,
was when I kind of
was
remember this
it was
really
someone else,
accelerating.
but it was the title was the transgender tipping point, the next civil rights frontier. Let me see if I can find it actually.
Okay, yeah, do. I'm just trying to mess with my charger here. Because I'm
May of 2019. It is Laverne Cox.
Oh, Laverne Cox, sure. Okay. I'm aware of who Laverne Cox is. I don't remember. I think Caitlyn Jenner was the one that I really remember exploding onto the scene and being,
Yeah.
and because I didn't follow sports, I didn't have a good memory of who Bruce Jenner was, so that didn't really mean anything to me. But back to the point I was making, I think that when this conversation began 5 or 10 years ago, who we all thought we were talking about were a very small group of people with a very serious condition called gender dysphoria, which causes them to feel like they need to present as the opposite gender to the one into which they were born. And the initial plea there from the left was affirm this because it's an act of kindness, because these are people who have a condition that therapy does not have a good track record of treating. And this is really the only way they have to live. And your choice is effectively be cruel to them and hurt their feelings every time you interact with them, or go along with it and be nice. And really, what does it cost you to do that? And I actually think that the bulk of polite society was willing to go along with that. And the only people who weren't really were the outliers. The Ben Shapiro is saying, no, I'm not doing this because I think that this is a slippery slope we're stepping onto. And I think that these categories exist for a reason. I think they describe something real. And I don't think people should be able to socially transition from one to the other in a way that gets affirmed by society. But in any event, I'm functionally a liberal, and so I'm absolutely going to be sympathetic to an argument that says you be nice to another person when it costs you nothing not to do that. Now I think we have this second category, which is full of people who, again, might fit into any number of different subcategories, but people who do not have gender dysphoria in the way that we commonly understand this condition to operate. And that the at the least sympathetic end of that spectrum is like the bearded guy in a wig wanting to shower at the YWCA.
Mhm.
And I don't think that the initial bout of activism to try to affirm trans identities was assumed to cover that guy. But then we ran into this problem of, okay, well, how do we decide who's in what category? And the UK actually hit this fight before the US. It's really just now accelerating in the US, I think. And that's that, well, the standard's got to be self ID. It's got anyone who says they're in this category is in this category. Well, that obviously issued a huge invitation to a lot of people who really are not transgender in the way we understand that term to mean, but who find it useful to pretend that they are in some or all circumstances. And a
What's
lot
the
of people,
distinction between really being transgender and pretending to be transgender in all circumstances?
exactly. And I don't have a good framework for determining who should be in which category, but I think it's very clear to me that there are at least two categories of people that we're talking about here. And there are some popular trans influencers who have been sounding this alarm. I don't know if you're familiar with Brianna Wu from Gamergate, Brianna Wu.
I know a little bit about them. Yeah.
Okay, so Brianna is trans and is trans in the traditional gender dysphoric from a very young age sense. And what she has been saying is that there are a huge number of people claiming this identity right now who did not go through what I went through, who do not have the condition that I have, and who are sort of vacuuming up these rights and protections that were intended for people like me, and this social acceptance that was fought for by people like me. And they shouldn't have any access to it because they're not in that group any more than Rachel Dolezal should get the whatever protections we afford to Black people when she is not Black. And the difficulty
But
is
wait, are
that
you saying that in that analogy, you're saying that Brianna Wu is like the actual black people and the extreme trans
yes,
activists are like Rachel Dolezal?
exactly, because Brianna Wu has gender dysphoria in the way that medical science and psychiatric science understood that condition to work.
Hmm.
And the guy with a beard that he hasn't trimmed in a wig at the YWCA wanting to take a shower. He doesn't have that. He just doesn't. And there are none of the classic presentations are present there. None of what we understand the symptoms to be are present there. There is not a serious psychiatric harm being perpetrated against that person if their supposed gender is not affirmed. And so we don't really need to tiptoe around that guy in the way we might want to make some accommodations for someone like Brianna. And I'm very sympathetic to that argument. The trouble is the people who have actually tried to look into this and to say there really might be two categories at work here. And one of these groups of people we might really want to help. I'm talking about somebody like Lisa Littman. Are you familiar with her?
No, I'm
She
not.
was she was the one who did the initial work on what she called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And this was very early in the discussion over trans issues. And a popular trans rights talking point is that, oh, Littman's work has been debunked. But of course, that's not really true. What happened was Littman was effectively run out of town for trying to make it was qualitative research that she did. So it had a lot to do with talking to parents of young people who were sort of at the early edge of this trend of young adolescent girls saying that they were trans, which was already not a classic presentation of gender dysphoria because typically it starts much younger, or it was understood to have started much younger. And it was usually natal boys and men saying it. So the phenomenon of adolescent girls claiming this identity was very new, and she wanted to understand what it was. And the term that she came up for it was rapid onset gender dysphoria. Well, people hated this on the left because it was seen as being, I don't even know if stalking horse is the right term. It was seen as being automatically unaffirming of a huge group of people, that it basically said, well, if you got to this late, if you didn't figure out that you were trans until later, we're going to say that you're not really and validly trans. Um, and so people had a huge problem with her work, but I think that was a tactical error on the part of trans rights activists, because by slamming the lid shut on that conversation, the trans rights movement then never developed any mechanism for saying Rachel Dolezal is not in our group. And this person who is on TikTok making these very provocative claims or behaving in very provocative ways, those people are not representative of us. They're not in our club. And so without that vocabulary, if this is a supposedly oppressed identity category into which absolutely anyone can identify, and we're not permitted to question that, then circling back to the sports issue, well, now you've got a problem, because if we have no way of actually determining who is supposed to have access to this particular space, if it is really just down to anyone who raises their hand may access this space. For one thing, I don't think there's anything liberal about that. So it is bizarre to me that the left became so attached to this idea. But also, you then have done away with the most obvious safety rail preventing bad actors from accessing these rights and these spaces.
Right. So there are some cases that are pretty obvious. Like there was someone named Jessica Yaniv in
I remember this,
Canada
yeah.
who was a man who went to a Brazilian waxing place and he demanded that the lady there wax his balls.
Back to the balls.
When she refused, he took her to court saying
Passion.
she violated his human rights. So that person's obviously intentionally malicious. Do you think
Yes.
though that do you think there's anyone who genuinely believes themselves to be trans but is not really trans by your definition? Maybe someone who got swept up in the rapid onset craze.
Oh, yes, I certainly think that. I think there are probably a lot of people who are not intentional. I know this for a fact, actually, because I have encountered some of these people. But oh no, there are absolutely who legitimately believe themselves to be part of this group, but are probably not by its strict. I don't want to say DSM-4 or DSM-5 because I can't remember which one of them had which definition. But this is a medical phenomenon and a psychiatric phenomenon that has been studied. There is not a huge amount of scholarly research into it because it's a very rare condition. But it wouldn't be accurate to say that it's a condition about which we know nothing. And we do know some
Right.
things about
But if there's someone even who's like a 15-year-old girl, or let's say they're a 50-year-old man who's suddenly come out as a trans woman, um, if you brought up the argument before that there are some people who just feel very uncomfortable and want to be seen as the other gender, and so we should be nice to them and treat them that way. Why wouldn't that argument apply just as much to the 50-year-old man who's become a trans woman?
it. Well, see, this is the thing. If you say, you can either say, well, there should be no guardrails and, or sorry, no like access card to it, which would be self-ID. And that was the big fight they had in the UK. I don't think that self-ID is a good standard here. So then I think what your question is what should be the standard? How do we actually say, well, yes, you have this and you belong in this category, but you do not?
Yeah, how we should determine
You
that
getting
socially and also what you think the real distinction is. Because sometimes there would be a real distinction even if we wouldn't be able to detect it from
right?
the outside.
So the second question, I don't have any idea of how to answer in terms of what should be the real distinction, because it could you hypothetically have somebody who has been suffering from gender dysphoria since a very young age, sort of what I outlined as the classic presentation. But and this was the trans rights side of the argument here, is that in our hypothetical here, this person is not aware of transgender being a valid identity category at all. They have no exposure to it. They're in a place where their identity would not be affirmed, where they would probably be mistreated for adopting it. And so 5 to 10 years ago, when this conversation kicks into a higher gear, they're on the internet, they become aware of it, they see, okay, well, this is a valid thing that I can be, and that actually reflects my true self better than the way I've been living, so I'm going to transition now. And that is assumed to be the pedigree of a late transitioner for I think most on the left, that they assume, well, this person was always trans, but they did not have the social permission to live as their authentic self.
Right.
I don't that's not falsifiable, right? It's certainly not falsifiable for, a guy writing on Substack who doesn't know that
Well, it's
person.
not
And
falsifiable for any individual. I think it is, it's interesting though, because what I've heard is that the people who come out as trans, there's really two groups. There's adolescent girls, and then there are uh, older men, like in their 50s. It's pretty
Mhm.
rare, from what I've heard, for a woman in her 50s to decide that she's a trans man, and it's
That is
less
extremely uncommon. Yep.
it's less common for adolescent boys than for adolescent girls to become trans. So if it was really people who had been suppressed the whole time coming out now that they could find it on the internet, it does seem strange that it would be almost entirely uh, males who come out. And in
Yeah,
the case to me, I think that men are just more willing to do extreme things than women. And
that could be.
I would argue that that's the reason why more older men come out. But I think that also teenage girls are more susceptible to propaganda than teenage boys, and so I suspect that's why they get swept up in the social trend a bit more.
So yeah, I mean, a big dimension of this debate, it's not really relevant in a policy sense, but it might be relevant as part of the broader conversation, is trans activists are fond of pointing to greater social acceptance as the reason for the phenomenon we're describing, of so many adolescent natal girls suddenly announcing, oh, I'm trans and I'm going to transition. And then in some cases, but not all cases, trying to access the medical interventions that actually are supposed to aid these transitions. So is it social acceptance that is doing that? Or is it, as you just implied, social contagion that is doing that, which is the more turfy side of the argument, where what they're saying there is they're just getting caught up in this. This is a fad. It's like goth or it's like emo, except in there was no institutionalized adult presence affirming people's goth identities.
Right.
So and there's no medical intervention other than maybe getting a lot of piercings that is associated with being goth. So, or I guess having your lower rib removed if you're Marilyn Manson, except I think that was a joke. But so in any case, it social contagion or is it social acceptance? Well, I've always really understood those to be two sides to the same coin. Because if it's acceptance, what's the transmission route? Well, we might not like the word contagion because it usually has a negative connotation, but doesn't always. You
Right.
could say
Right.
laughter is contagious.
Social acceptance is transmitted from one person to other people.
Exactly. So it's really the same thing that you're describing. And if you were, that cuts both ways, of course. If you are strongly on the it's a social contagion, it's a fad side of it. Okay, well, what's the contagion? Acceptance. So we're the two sides are talking past each other on that particular thing. I think what everyone agrees on is that having broader social acceptance of transness has led to more people finding out about that, which has led to more people claiming the identity. And the issue there is, and especially this gets really thorny when you're talking about medicalization, because you do not want to medicalize somebody who does not absolutely need to be medicalized. These are very
Right.
serious interventions in ways that get glossed over by some of the activists who talk about them. Um, and in a case where you've got somebody with a serious, and this is the reason I've never come down, and I can't really bring myself to say, well, I am against youth gender medicine. I'm not, because for one thing, I've spent my entire adult life saying that I don't think the government should interfere with people's private medical decisions, and I continue to think that. But I do think there need to then be clear safeguards to prevent uh, these medical interventions from being applied to people who do not absolutely need them. And if the only standard for that is, well, we're going to give you maybe a handful of evaluations with therapists or with practitioners who are under serious, in some cases, professional pressure to have the outcome of those evaluations be to affirm, that's not a good system of safeguards. And you're going to end up harming people who you should not have harmed. Of course, if you ban them entirely, as many commentators have argued for, well, then that person who is in what we understood to be almost this whole category before 10 years ago, that person who from childhood has felt as though this was not the body they were supposed to have, this is not how they want to present themselves to the world, and they are going to be at serious risk of either self-harm or some kind of serious psychiatric distress in a prolonged way if they are not allowed these interventions. I don't want to ban them for those people, but I don't think you can have no safeguards. And I don't think your standard can be no person who thinks that they should access these services can ever be denied them, because they are really serious. And there might be any number of reasons why a young person, particularly in adolescence, particularly not fitting the classic presentation, might want to access these services other than that they really need them. So, and the same is not, there's just no equivalent in other kinds of medicine. There's no blood test for this. There's no MRI that's going to show you for sure this person is in this category or not. So it's always going to be a subjective process of evaluation. And
Right.
I would have a lot more faith in that if there weren't so much pressure on the evaluators to return a particular verdict on that, because then that's not really an evaluation. It's the veneer of one, it's the process.
Right.
It's a show
I'm
right
a
there.
conservative. I really don't believe in the concept of mental health. I think that people can have bad mental habits, but I don't think that health is a correct analogy to having a bad mental habit. And so I've always viewed the DSM with suspicion, and I think a lot of other conservatives have as well. And so then when we see the youth trans stuff, we think, yeah, I knew that was crazy all along, and now they're just proving it. Uh,
Right.
and I think there are historical parallels as well. Like you mentioned being goth, but we could look farther back in history to times when like elite European women had those super tight corsets that crush their ribs, or Chinese
Yeah, the promises and yeah.
breaking their daughters' feet to make them more dainty or something
Hmm.
like that. There have been these, or even maybe something modern, like have you seen the pictures of, I don't know how it's pronounced, buccal fat removal? There are these famous women who get this horrifying surgery where they like take the fat out of their cheeks and it makes them look like
No,
skeletons.
I've never seen that.
It's this new beauty trend which makes people look like very disturbing. Hopefully, it won't
Right.
last very much longer. But it seems like there are these extreme body modification uh, trends or cults almost always with women, it seems. And I think that maybe this young girl's getting these transgender procedures might be something similar.
Yeah, and that is becoming, as we're moving away from aggressive content moderation on social media platforms. The argument you just made is an increasingly common one. And now that was an argument that you couldn't make before Elon bought Twitter, basically, because
Right.
it was folded under the umbrella of hate speech. And indeed, there are still people who consider it hate speech because you're not affirming, and you can't not affirm. You have to affirm. That was never going to be a standard that was going to be sustainable on an open debating floor. And it really depended on top down content moderation and nope, you said the wrong thing, now you're off. It depended on that to proliferate. And now that that isn't happening anymore, these ideas are running into more scrutiny than they've ever run into before. And in some cases, they're collapsing. Because if the only rhetorical tool you've ever used to defend your side is you're evil and you're a bigot and now you're canceled, and you suddenly can't do that anymore, well, what do you have to fall back on? So I am, and again, I'm not a conservative, so I am interested in protecting the dignity and the happiness and the prosperity of people who have severe psychiatric conditions. I am, which means somebody that is living as trans is fine in my book. I don't have a problem with society affirming them. I don't even have a problem writ large in any kind of top-down way with their inclusion in some women's spaces. But I am against the idea that we can never discuss this or that discussing it is bigotry because there
Right.
are going to be unfair circumstances. And it's like access to women's locker rooms or women's bathrooms. I'm not a woman. It's not something that is personally affecting me or going to affect me, but it is going to personally affect the women in my life. And I don't think you can just say anyone who raises their hand and says, that's me, I belong there, gets to go. That's not going to be possible. I'm in favor of some wiggle room. And by the way, the queen of all turfs, J.K. Rowling, that was initially her argument. People forget this, but what now she has become much more extreme. I think being buried under an avalanche of rape and death threats will do that to you. But what she initially started saying was that she doesn't necessarily have a problem with somebody who has really undergone a serious physical and social transformation and is now living as the other gender, with them in some cases accessing women's spaces. She doesn't necessarily have a problem with that. And it's probably not fair for me to be paraphrasing her so briefly there. But what she does have a problem with is self-ID. And she has a problem with the idea that this has waved a great big welcome banner in the faces of bad actors who are exploiting this identity category and exploiting our affirmation for it in order to get access to spaces they shouldn't be in. And in the UK in particular, this really has happened in some quite grotesque ways, where you had serial sex predators claiming a trans identity post arrest and being
Right.
incarcerated in women's correctional facilities. Well, that's complete madness. And there is no part of my liberalism, however squishy, that is going to convince me that that is anything other than utter nonsense and dangerous nonsense, because
Yeah.
you are putting the women in those places in a very dangerous and vulnerable situation. Now, I would not extend that I would not extend my skepticism of men who do things like that and place it on all people who say they are trans or all people who are living as trans, which is why I think becoming honest about the fact that there is more than one category angling for rights and access here is ultimately the only thing that is going to save what remains of the trans rights movement. And I do have an interest in people who are living with this condition not being browbeaten out of expressing themselves. I'm too liberal to ever get behind something like that. But in my view, sitting back and kind of quietly nodding while a group of activists make a huge mess, which is what's happened with the trans rights movement, there's nothing, there's no part of what the left likes to call allyship that I think includes that. And or in which there's no framework in which that's a good idea. If I see you doing something that is harmful and stupid, and I'm not supposed to say what you're doing is harmful and stupid because that's not nice enough, I don't really want any part of a project that encourages that kind of silent acquiescence. It's stupid. It's fundamentally illiberal. And I think it took empathy and it weaponized it. And
Yeah.
that that explains a lot of what is is plaguing not just the trans rights movement, but the gay rights movement by their association with the trans rights movement. So the downstream effects of this have been terrible, and it's been perpetrated mostly not by trans people, of whom there are not enough to have done this on their own, but of mostly well-intentioned allies who, in this context, I really equate to like those firemen who go around setting fires so that they can be the one to put them out. It's like you shoved this group of people into the public spotlight in the most maximally unhelpful for them way. And now the consequences of that are not going to be felt by you because you personally don't lose anything. Maybe a couple of your social media mutuals do, but that's not the same thing. And so much we could expand this because this
I'm not
framework
sure
that
the
I
number of trans people is really that small. From what I've seen, more than 1% of Generation Z identifies as trans.
yeah,
So to put
that's
that in
true.
context, the percentage of trans people in Generation Z is higher than the percentage of LGBT people in silent generation pre-boomers.
Right. No, I believe that's true. I think that those statistics are skewed somewhat by all of the survey data we have asking people if they're in that category in a slightly different way.
Okay.
So, for example, somebody who is not undergoing any medical intervention to transition and might only identify as trans some of the time could be counted as being in the same group as somebody like Brianna Wu, who we mentioned earlier, who has been living as a woman her entire adult life. So you're absolutely right that it is a much bigger category than it has ever been. This statistic might be wrong, but it gets tossed around a lot. There was something like in the last 5 or 10 years, a 4,000% increase in the number of natal girls identifying as trans. And in some cases, they are accessing medical interventions, and in some cases, they are not.
Hmm.
Um, but is it meaningful when you're putting somebody who has they them pronouns on Instagram, and that's really the only meaningful way in which they are not just a cisgendered person, with somebody who has had this condition their whole life and has been taking steps
I
to
see your point.
accommodate it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a huge category, but it's filled with, back to my original point, it's filled with lots and lots and lots of different subgroups. And there has been an enormous amount of hostility towards digging into that notion on the left. And I think it has been ultimately self-defeating on the left.
Well, let me ask you one more challenging question.
Sure, please.
There's a condition, I believe it may be in the DSM. I'm not sure. Well, there are people trying to add it to the DSM if it's not already there. It's called body integrity identity disorder. And this is when there's a
I know
person
this.
who is able-bodied, but they identify as disabled. So there was one person who identified as one hand Joe, and then he actually did cut off his hand with a saw.
I've heard
There's
this.
another
Yeah.
woman who went, this is, um, she went on the Dr. Phil show because she identified as blind and she found a therapist who was willing to pour a chemical, I think, drain cleaner into her eye to blind her.
Yeah. So how do we fold that into the conversation about being transgender? That is a genuinely difficult one philosophically. I mean, I think in a practical sense, it's not because there are, if it's a vanishingly small number of people who are accessing gender medicine, it's an even smaller number of people who want their healthy limbs cut off. The parallels, though, are obvious, and I'm not going to pretend that they aren't. Philosophically, I think that if you are an adult and you have been, I don't even know what evaluation criteria could exist to determine that somebody who really only wants
Right.
to have one leg but has two, where a doctor would say, okay, you can, I'll chop your leg off for you. I don't know. I think philosophically, though, I have to come down on the side of if it's really what you want, you can do it. You're an adult, it's your body. If you want to take a
I
chunk of it
agree,
off,
actually. I think that it should be their right to
yeah.
do that to themselves. But I also personally would not affirm their identity, and I would not affirm trans people's
And
identity.
you would not say, well, but actually, let me challenge you back then, because if somebody really wants to be a paraplegic, and so they intentionally paralyze themselves so that they would be a paraplegic, wouldn't they? I
Well,
mean,
then I
and
would
so
acknowledge they were paraplegic. But if an able-bodied person told me they identified as a paraplegic and they were making these plans to paralyze themselves, then I would very firmly tell them that they were deluded and they should not go through with these plans.
that they should not go through
And
with
and
that.
I would say that their paraplegic identity itself is a delusion that they should not indulge.
That they should seek help for. Yeah.
Right.
So one of the dimensions to the discussion over trans people is I don't. We're told quite commonly that therapy does not work for treating gender dysphoria, or that it doesn't have a good track record. I don't really know how true that is or how false that is. I have to assume, given the political and cultural climate that existed prior to 10 years ago, that these people would have been put through quite rigorous therapy before being permitted to access more serious interventions like surgical alterations to their bodies. So there probably is some good evidence to suggest that you can't sort of therapy this out of people.
I'm
But
skeptical. I think that the therapists are in on it and part of the problem a lot of the time. Like
well,
that,
and that's definitely true now. And it's true for a structural reason. It's not that they're all necessarily bad actors. It's that the trans activists have taken great pains to regard therapeutic interventions for gender dysphoria as being functionally the same as conversion therapy for gay people, which
hmm
has a terrible and abusive track record.
hmm
And so if it really is that, well, then no, we absolutely shouldn't do it. There's just not a good reason to think that it is really like that. And we don't have any data to say that it definitely is or that it definitely isn't. And what data we do have, and this is one of the things I talked about in my last piece, is motivated. It's motivated reasoning. So if your position is that absolutely trans identities are valid, and if that is not a rail you are ever really going to be able to grab, you're going to end up doing pretty incomplete writing and pretty incomplete thinking and pretty incomplete research about that topic, because the elephant in the room is not one that you're permitted to address. Well, what if you actually don't have this, and talking to somebody about it would help you see that? If we can't acknowledge
right.
that that could ever be a reasonably expected outcome here, then you're not going to know. And if you're dealing with an activist group that really does regard even the suggestion that you seek a therapeutic intervention before carrying out with some kind of medical one, well, that's conversion therapy. It's erasure. It's maybe even a form of genocide. I don't see how it's possible to have a productive conversation about how to help people who are in distress. and we ought to want to have that conversation. So it's
Right.
been very annoying to me that the discussion has kind of been hijacked by, again, who I regard as bad actors.
Well, I want to ask you, the next question I want to ask you is about the activists. You had in your piece a list of issues that are 80-20. So one of them
Yeah.
was uh, trans males in women's sports. 80% of
Mhm.
the public is against that. And
Yep.
for context, in these surveys, you almost never get less than 10%. Like if you ask people, should America be a monarchy, 10% will say yes.
Are
And
going to say
that was
yes.
pre-Trump, by the way, so it's probably
Right.
higher now. Yeah, and there'll always be a couple of percent of people who say they don't know. So if something is 80-20, that is actually quite close to unanimity. And I
It
think you
really
had
is.
some other issues you had that um I don't remember everything you listed, but you said that people thought meth should be illegal by an 80-20 margin, and people
Yeah. Who's
wanted
the
to.
20% who wants meth legalized? There are people who philosophically
Well, as
favor
a
all drugs.
libertarian, I want meth legalized. So
Right. Yeah.
I'm
You're in that 20.
disappointed to see that I'm on the wrong side. I'm on the unpopular side of that issue, but I think I was on the majority side of the others. But we don't have a active meth legalization activist movement that's controlling a major political party. Why do you think it
No.
is that the trans activist movement is so powerful, given that why are they so much more powerful than all these other 20% side issues?
So that's a really good question. And I think a lot of it is that there are a lot of things I want to say about this. I'm trying to think of which one I should say first. I think that on the left in particular, my generation, so I'm in my 40s. So the millennial generation, certainly the Gen X generation, were told that there is basically no more noble thing you can be than a civil rights crusader. All of our political heroes on the left were civil rights crusaders. They were change makers. And so there is a strong propensity of people on the left to go looking for political causes that allow them to fearlessly advocate on behalf of the downtrodden. The problem for this subset is that there actually aren't that many people who are trodden upon now because of their identity, because we have put legal safeguards in place to ensure that that can't happen in any wide scale way. That was the legal legacy of the civil rights era. So when they have found a group that actually there are some serious challenges facing us in terms of how we determine how they should be included and how we should regard them and how we should live alongside them. And you've got something like, well, 80% of people don't think that this group of people should be allowed to play sports with biological women and girls. They're activated now because now they've found the crusade. Now they've found the cause that they can nobly fight. So you've got what is effectively a posture in search of an application for it. And in
Yeah.
transcripts, they've found it. And also, just generally speaking, the left has been animated by civil rights projects for since the middle 20th century. So anything that even smells like one, a lot of them are going to jump on board that train because to most of the left, the legacy of civil rights progress is fundamentally good. It follows then that we should carry it on. Now, you're a libertarian, so I'm guessing you might have some contrary things to say about the civil rights era.
Yeah, I don't think the civil rights. I think that most of the civil rights movement was not a good thing. That's probably
Right.
a different.
Yeah.
That's probably a separate
And
podcast, though. That'd be a long topic.
that would, yeah, that could maybe our next one. But so I think that
I'm
to
actually, so
have,
I just brought up your list of these 80-20 issues. It
oh
was
yeah, thanks.
oppose cutting police and soft on crime policies.
Hmm.
80% of people oppose legalizing meth, heroin, and fentanyl, unfortunately for me. 80%
Yeah.
support legal weed. 80% support access to birth control. 80% oppose post-viability abortions. And 80% oppose abortion bans that don't include exceptions for rape or incest. That last one jumped out at me because this is another one where the lobby for the unpopular side really does have power. So
Absolutely.
um, the pro-life organizations almost uniformly want to ban abortion in all cases, including rape and incest. Now, most Republicans do not want that, but the Republican information, the Republican position promulgating organizations, those pro-life organizations, they get to set the tone just because their people are the most animated about the issue and they show up. So maybe it's something similar with transgenderism. Maybe the transgender activists just care the most.
I think there certainly is. I also think that it, there's another problem in both situations that probably explains some of it. And it's that these taking the most ideologically rigid position on offer is very easy to defend because you can just sort of cross your arms, plant your feet, and there you go. It's easily soundbited. To take a slightly more moderate position gets you into some thorny territory. So if you're on the right and you believe that abortion is akin to ending a human life, and
Mhm.
you want to explain why ending a human life in some circumstances, but not other circumstances, should be okay, that is philosophically rough terrain to navigate.
Yeah,
And
I
on
think
the
you have
left,
to say that it's not murder if you want to say there should be exceptions.
exactly. And so much of the right-wing position on abortion is predicated on the idea that, oh no, this is literally murder. That is a human life you are ending. On the left, it's slightly different with trans, but there's a similar dimension to it. It's the farthest left position is basically civil rights for all, right? It's social, it's acceptance and rights for everybody. Well, if you want to take
But why are
a
the
slightly
transgender
moderate,
concerns cast as civil rights?
because it's to the activist community most animated by this, it is an immutable feature of identity. So they don't regard this as if they see somebody who is identified later into the trans category, remember, that's a consequence of them not having had permission to do it earlier. It doesn't actually say anything about the validity of the category itself. So if trans is immutable in the way that race is, in the way that biological sex is, in the way that, for that matter, height is, you can't change it. You get what you get. If being trans is along those lines, then we don't have a good philosophical case for restricting access to anything because these are people who are deserving of full human rights. It's when you start to acknowledge that not everybody claiming to be part of this category really is. That's when it starts to get thorny. So already, if you're
Right.
staking a more moderate piece of territory, you've already upset a lot of people
To play
whose
devil's
focus.
advocate, though, it seems like, for example, what if Leonardo DiCaprio told us, I like dating women who are 20 to 25 because I was born this way. I just have this innate attraction to be attracted to 20 to 25-year-old women. Now, I think that would be a true statement. He probably was born with having those kinds of attractions. But the reason why we are sympathetic to gay men who say they were born that way and we're less sympathetic to Leonardo DiCaprio is because the idea is that gay men don't really have a reasonable alternative choice. They can't just because to tell a gay man they can't have a gay relationship means they have to be single for life. And it seems like
Right,
Leonardo DiCaprio could just marry a woman and stay married to her, and that seems like a reasonable alternative option. Now,
right.
with the trans thing, to me, it seems quite reasonable to demand that Leah Thomas swim on the men's team.
Yeah. And in that case, probably that's what should have happened. I did write a little bit about Thomas in the piece we're talking about and in my more recent one. I don't think that Leah Thomas deserves to get all of the shit that she gets, but because ultimately she was allowed to do what she did. And if we think that that was unfair or that she shouldn't have done that, that she should have sort of bowed out from it, I think that is a reasonable case to make. But what we ought to focus on as political thinkers is the system that allowed it. And could there, because it is also, look, it's not an untrue thing to say that Thomas did not win all of the events in which she competed. So and I just wrote about this. This is a really common argument on the side of inclusion that, well, trans people don't always win. So you actually can't always predict that they're going to dominate in these competitions. And it's sort of true to say that with regard to Thomas, we fixate on the one race that she did win, and we kind of have memory hold the ones that she didn't.
Yeah, but
So
Thomas was still ahead.
I
In
don't
each of
think that's
those
a good
races,
argument.
wasn't there one woman who was kicked out of a finalist slot?
Bingo. So, and that is a good counter argument to it. And it's that if no, if we're intending these spaces to be preserved for biological women, even the inclusion of one trans person who is not dominating the competition is still an injustice. And this is what I regarded as being the more interesting question with regard to trans participation in sport is we're not having an argument about inclusion because again, had Leah Thomas been told well, you may not compete on the women's team, she would have still been eligible for the men's team. There is really only one exception to that, and that's if you're a biological female taking hormones, that might disqualify you from sport entirely. Because if you're not going to be allowed to play with the men because you've got the wrong gametes, and you're not going to be allowed to play with the women because you're taking hormones that they are not taking, or you've made your
So you're
body
saying it
more
would be
fit.
like doping, like
It
taking
would, yeah. I
drugs.
don't think I don't think that's a good moral equivalent, but it probably is a good outcome equivalent, and so it may have to be treated the same way. But the question over trans girls and women competing in sports leagues for girls and women is really just a question about what kind of segregation we want. So, and yeah, a secondary question is, do we want any segregation at all? Which is where I ultimately took my argument. It's like, well, what if we just didn't have segregation? But do we want it by biological sex, which is sort of the more traditional view, or do we want it by gender identity? And do we have some basis for thinking that gender identity might be a better divide, that that might be a better way to segregate sports? And I am open to somebody explaining that it is. And there are some arguments that are don't touch on biology at all that say, oh no, that actually is a great category because we've got all of these sociocultural conditions that give boys an advantage over girls. And so we don't, the biology is almost secondary to the fact that like boys are likely to have more opportunities to play sport. They're going to have better equipment. Their locker room is going to be nicer. When they get to college, their football program is on national television and the girls program isn't. So there really are people who try to reduce the entire performance gap to that oh well, they got better opportunities. They
Yeah,
had
I don't think that's very plausible.
I don't think that's true at all. I think it's a ridiculous argument, and almost nobody actually makes it. It's a red herring. It's a well, have you considered that what if biology isn't really what explains these differences? It's something else.
Hmm.
And that could be socioculture something. I don't find that remotely persuasive, but and again, I think I regard it as mostly a distraction from the broader argument. But the broader argument really just is about are we segregating by biological sex or are we segregating by gender identity? And I think the reason that we don't talk about it in exactly those direct terms is because that's a much more boring question. So if you have this activist set who have been attracted to this issue because what they really want to be is fired up in support of the downtrodden, well, now we don't really have a group that's downtrodden. We have a group that's being held to the exact same standard everyone else is. They're just disappointed with the outcome of that. So it's not interesting to people.
Okay, so you're saying that once you make clear that it's about choosing whether we segregate by gender identity or by sex or by weight class, then the complaining about it just sounds like anyone is going to have there's in any system someone is going to have grounds to complain. Like if
Yeah,
it's not segregated by weight class and you are a short basketball player, then you're just kind of out of luck.
you're kind of out of luck unless you're Muggsy Bogues, right? But
Mm.
it's also just a fundamentally boring question, and it folds it more into like, oh, I'm really disappointed that I didn't make varsity and they stuck me on JV. It's like, well, nobody regards that as a political issue. It's not an interesting topic. We don't have think pieces in the Atlantic about it. Um, should we? I don't know. One of the things I put at the end of my article was, did you see this exchange on Pierce Morgan with Riley Gaines and a trans influencer named Blossom Brown?
Yes, I did. I did. I watched it.
Yeah. So what if one of your listeners didn't catch it? Riley Gaines was pressing Brown on, okay, well, if really like there should be no segregation in sports at all. Why don't we just have Paralympians competing against normally abled Olympians? And Blossom Brown went, well, we should. And in my piece, I said, you know what? I'm actually okay with that argument philosophically because Blossom Brown is using the framing I wish we would all use here, which is, do we favor segregation or do we not? And if we do, what kind of segregation do we want? This isn't about civil rights. This is just about holding, we have a standard for athletic participation. Everybody is held to it. Now, Blossom Brown would like that standard to be there is no segregation in sports, including by physical ability. And that's actually, I think it's about the worst idea I've ever heard that you could ever apply to sport. But there is a philosophical consistency to it because we all like, we segregate sports by ability right now. You make varsity or you make JV. If she doesn't think we should be doing that, I'm open to that argument. Have everyone play together, and you're just going to have some dominant players and some weaker players, and that's okay. You already have dominant players and weak players on the team. I think that it would cool things down if we could talk about this in that frame rather than in the civil rights frame, which, as I've said, I don't think is a good one for this conversation anyway. I don't think it fits.
Mm-hmm.
So, but of course, if your interest is
Yeah, but
not
it's
cool down,
so I wonder if part of the reason why the left sees it as a civil rights issue is because I wonder if the left is just extremely averse to telling someone that they can't do something,
that's certainly the case.
especially if it's based on something that's seen to be an immutable characteristic.
That's absolutely true of the left. I don't, I have a more conspiratorial worldview about it a little bit in that I think that there are a lot of bad actors who are just cause heads and who just want to be an activist on kind of whatever the issue is. And
Right.
so they'll drop in on trans, they'll drop in on pro-Palestine, they'll drop in on whatever the thing that allows them to be the fieriest agitator.
Did you see
Um,
that Keir Starmer, as soon as the British Supreme Court declared that sex would be defined, um, that trans women would not legally be counted as women for sex discrimination, Keir Starmer changed his position to say, yes, of course, it refers to biological sex in the law.
I didn't see that, but it doesn't surprise me. I think you're going to see a lot of awkward backing away from this issue in the
Yeah.
coming years, because I also think that it's so many of the people who were talking about it were captive, as we all were, to the conversational guidelines that were established by those fiery activists and by
Yeah.
people who had an interest in rigidly policing the discourse on this issue. And now that those people have lost a lot of their power, you're going to see a lot of people who are more on the middle and more in the middle in the way that I am on this, finally speaking out and saying, well, here's like a list of 20 things that I think you're doing wrong that I've been thinking for 10 years, but you would have absolutely taken a flamethrower to me if I'd said it 8 years ago. So now that I can say it, now that I can put that on Twitter and my account isn't going to lock me out, or I can put it on YouTube and not be demonetized, you're hearing from new voices in this debate now. And they are not all, so the kind of the first crop of those new voices were people who were virulently anti-trans. The turf set, people who want trans, I think it was Michael Knowles who said, we want to eradicate transgenderism. And this was taken by activists to be a call for genocide. Well, those were the first people to speak out who were not just trans activists. Now you're getting this new group of people, in which I would include myself, who I have no interest in banning trans people from doing things. I have no interest in banning anyone from doing anything unless there is some problem with their inclusion. It will never stop being weird to me that the activists chose the handful of the absolute thorniest issues, the issues where there really is a strong case to be made that widespread inclusion could have deleterious effects. And they made all of the activism about that. That is so weird to me. And in a sense, they had to, because trans people were covered by the Obergefell decision. They can get married, they can work. In a lot of cases, there are anti-discrimination laws that protect their employment opportunities. And
Judge Neil
so,
Gorsuch, who was one of the Trump appointees on the Supreme Court, joined the liberals in a pro-trans decision a couple years ago.
yeah, really, I didn't see that.
Yeah, so
Um,
his legal philosophy is called surprise plain meaning, meaning that
okay, you'll have to explain it.
he rules that the law means what it says on the page, even if that ends up being an intent totally different than what the people of the who wrote the law intended. And so he
Wow.
said that if you wouldn't fire a woman for wearing a wig and a dress, then you're also not allowed to fire a man for coming into work
Oh,
in a wig and a
okay.
dress. That was the
There's
decision.
got to be. What do you think about that? I mean, you're a conservative. You're a
I
libertarian,
certainly
right?
see I'm sort of half libertarian, half conservative. I certainly see the
Okay.
argument. I think that Neil Gorsuch is my favorite of the nine justices on the Supreme Court.
Okay.
So yeah, I see the argument, but I also think that I just think there are limits to strict legalism, and maybe this is one of those limits. Like, a woman coming into work in a dress is just different than a man coming into work in a dress. I don't know if I would.
And we kind of have to be able to just say that
We
it's
kind of have to
different,
be able to just say that. Yeah.
right? Yeah, that's interesting. And there really isn't a philosophical underpinning to my belief in any of this other than I'm a marshmallow and I want to be nice to people. And I think absent good cause to not be nice to somebody, you should be nice to somebody. It on the it again, it is a weird thing to me that the activists chose the 80-20 issues to
Right.
form the of all of their activism. And then they said, well, if you're in that 80%, which, as you point out, is really probably closer to 100%, because you are always going to have that person in the 10% who says, yes, we should eat our cats if we get hungry enough. Like, so is anyone in this 80% is evil and morally inferior to you and should be understood to be functionally the same as Nazis and segregationists? And well, I don't really think that that's sustainable or true.
I think that I wonder if some of it is that people have the idea that the left always wins these cultural disputes. And
Hmm.
so if they think that the left is inevitably going to win in the end, a lot of people want to get out in the front because they think, oh, if I'm in the vanguard, then I'm going to be remembered as the hero once
Yeah.
this movement has been victorious. And now that it's looking like the trans movement, or at least the most militant form of it, is not going to be victorious, those people are
Are backing away
surprised
from
to
that.
find themselves, yeah, not winning.
Yeah, it's right side of historyism. It's it kind of try
Right.
not wanting to be that person in the history book you look back on and go, oh my God, how did people ever believe that?
I think
Um,
that I think that the left really has been on a winning streak over the last 100 years. But
mhm.
another part of it is that there have been a couple of left-wing losses and they just get memory hold and they don't show up in the history books. So I think that
Right.
part of the idea of inevitable leftist victory, I think the idea of inevitable leftist victory is there's been some truth to it over the last 100 years, but it's also partly a sampling thing because they just memory hole all their losses. Like, for example, in the 1970s in the UK, there was a group called PI, which stood for Pedophile Information Exchange. And
This is like a NAMBLA cousin.
yeah, they were
Okay.
connected with the gay rights movement before they got pushed off the bus, and they explicitly advocated for the destigmatization of pedophilia. So that obviously there was a lot of pushback, and that got dropped. The history books
And we
don't
don't
tell
talk
about
about them now. Yeah.
the history books don't tell about the noble conservatives defeating the pedophile activists in the 70s, so that doesn't get picked up in the narrative. And
I
even
can't
something
imagine why.
like even eugenics, it was maybe not a left issue, but it was certainly an anti-conservative issue in the early 20th
Mhm.
century. It was the
Well,
idea,
Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. I
yes,
mean, we
yeah.
don't like talking about that on the left, and I don't even think people on the left know that for the most part. But
It
yeah,
was eugenics was seen as the scientific way of the future.
yep, absolutely. And I don't think you're going to find too many of today's leftists who are going to champion something like that.
Right.
Um, but no, I think you're absolutely onto something that we do on the left anyway. We do tend to try to view whatever the thing is we're looking at right now through the lens of how people 100 years from now will regard our actions. Because there are so many instances in our history books of people doing and believing and saying what we now regard as absolutely atrocious, morally indefensible things. And we go, well, how the hell did did that happen? How did so many otherwise good and educated people think slavery was okay? And so and it's, it's honestly not the worst impulse, not just of the left, but of anyone to go to interrogate what do I believe right now, and what actions am I taking right now that are going to be in 100 years regarded as absolutely morally heinous. One that I was just listening before we started talking. Forgive me, I'm not going to remember the man's name, but you were talking about animal rights with somebody. And I regard that as being the most likely candidate for people
I
in the
think it is
future are
too.
going to look
Yeah.
back on going, what in the hell? Like they were putting these animals in pens when they had other sources of food. They were even developing synthetic meat. So it wasn't like they were losing out on anything and they were still eating animals. Now, I'm not a vegan or a vegetarian. I eat meat all the time. And I'm not like an organic, I'll only free range eggs. No, I mean, I'm terrible. I eat veal. I eat foie gras when I can get my hands on it. But I absolutely think that in 100 years, if synthetic meats can take off, people are going to look back on what we did and go, "You were evil. It's straight up evil. How could you do that to animals?"
Yeah, I think that I'm not sure how true it is that lots of decent people were really pro-slavery. I think there were a lot of people who thought that slavery was a necessary evil. I think a lot of people thought it was not realistic to abolish it, or that the Civil War was a price too high to
Okay.
pay. But is um, certainly in the 1700s, like the founding fathers were not didn't excuse the morality of slavery. They basically just said, we have
Right.
the system. And Thomas Jefferson wanted black people to resettle in parts of West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
George Washington freed his slaves in his will when he died. So it was pretty widely agreed to be a bad thing. Um, they just didn't they just didn't end it. And you can see that as a moral failing, that they didn't have the gumption to live up to their ideals, or that they were just focused on other things and they had faith that things would gradually get better. And so
Right.
I think sometimes we have this view of the past that's like people were this cartoon of evil and they must have been totally on board with everything that was going on. But I think in reality, it was more like a lot of people acknowledge that those things were bad, but it's just the way of the world. Like if Andrew Jackson is expelling the Native Americans and kicking them out of their homes, I might think that's bad, but I'm also not gonna like get myself killed by taking up arms against the U.S. government.
Yep.
And
And
much like the attitude you described towards eating meat. So for myself, I was a very strict vegan for about 5 years. And I just found that it messed with my health more than I was willing to tolerate. So now I eat some animal products. Um, I wish I could be healthy and have a productive life while being a vegan, but I wasn't able to do it. So when
right.
if I had some way to only eat humanely raised animals that was affordable and reasonably practical, I would do so, but I just don't have the option right now.
Yeah. And I think my belief that our offspring in several generations may look back with ill will upon us for what we're doing to animals right now means that, when I actually, this was when I was very new to Substack and my articles were getting no traction at all. But I wrote a piece about Ron DeSantis wanting to ban research into synthetic. We're not going to have fake meat in Florida. He said that when he was
Yeah,
campaigning, so who knows what he really thinks? And it's like, well, that's ridiculous. Why would you want to do that?
yeah. I did
If I
not
can
know
eat
that from
something
Ron
that tastes
DeSantis.
just as good as a cheeseburger and some animal didn't have to suffer for it, the hell kind of moral compass would I have if I didn't want to do that? That's
Yeah.
weird. So anyway,
We're coming up on an hour and a half. Do you have any final thoughts?
I don't think so. If you have any final questions, I'm happy to answer them. This was a lot of fun, though. I hope we can do it
Yeah,
again sometime.
absolutely. Yeah, I had a great time. No, I think we covered everything. So great talking to you, and maybe we'll do this again.
I hope so, Simon. Pleased to meet you.
Great to meet you, Dave. See you later.
Yep.